McConnell Library, Radford University campus. And it's a beautiful day to be sitting out in the sun. And as you can see behind me, there's some great big columns that go up there. And I'm sure you guys can tell me what order of ancient Greek architecture those capitals are, right? You should. Anyway, one reason I'm sitting in front of these capitals is that this week we're talking about neoclassical artwork in Europe. Um, Especially in France, which is going to become considered the center of the art world, where artists are going to be trained and the things that they produce are going to have a heavy influence on artwork all over the world. The neoclassical, in some ways, was similar to the Renaissance because, once again, it's a reference to ancient Greek and Roman styles considered classical art, and so the neoclassical or the new classical is an extension of that. One difference about the neoclassical period is that this artwork becomes very political. So we see that classical reference, but it's being used for political reasons in order to help spread political messages. 1700s in France, a bloody time, at a time when blood was literally running down the streets. The French Revolution overthrew the monarchy and then led to really a lot of other problems that came up after the monarchy was gone. So keep in mind that revolution is up here, revolution is in your mind. That's where it needs to take place. It's in your own mind, in your hometown, with your friends and your loved ones. That's revolution. The other kind of revolution just leads to a big bloody mess, and those friends and those loved ones that you care for so much don't fare too well in the face of bombs and tanks and machine guns, which is what that kind of revolution leads to. So, something to think about. Anyway, if you look at the accompanying PowerPoint, we're talking about late 1700s in France with the French Revolution, and then we're going to get into the 1800s, which is called the 19th century, and we'll talk some about the Romantic movement in artwork and what that was all about. If you go to slide number 3, you'll see a great example of French neoclassical artwork. This is a painting by Jacques-Louis David, Oath of the Horatii, and this is a reference to a story about Romans. In ancient Rome, there was a war that was taking place that seemed unwinnable. It was dragging out. Many people on both sides being killed, had reached a stalemate. So in order to settle the war, each side picked 3 of their best soldiers to go fight to see who would win. On the Roman side, that was 3 brothers, and so we see their father here handing them their sword. In the background, you see females that appear by their body language to be in great distress over this, but if you look carefully at the faces, guess what? There's no emotion. That's right, it is a reference to the ancient Greek idea that problems could be solved with rationality, that issues like right or wrong didn't have to involve emotion, that humans could somehow rise above that, do their civic duty, and do what was right. So this painting is a political message about what's the right thing to do in this situation, and according to Jacques-Louis David, that was to pick up your sword and fight. So that's what this painting is saying. Slide number 4 is another piece by Jacques-Louis David, The Death of Marat. And Marat was a political writer who was assassinated in his home. You'll notice that he seems to be soaking in a bathtub. It's because Marat had a skin condition. He spent a lot of time in the tub to treat that. The letter he holds in his hand is a letter that someone gave him in order to get access to his house, and then that's the letter that he holds after he's been stabbed to death. Even though this is a bloody murder scene, the focus is not on the action like it would be in the Baroque period. The focus is on really the rational question: is this right or is it wrong? And if you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a bloody knife. It's almost disappeared from the picture, again because the focus is not on the violence, it's on the political questions that come up with this. Let's see where we're at. Slide number 5 shows you another style that was happening in Europe at this time, and that is Romanticism. And when you think about the word romantic, our modern definition of romance is a man and a woman who are in love or whatever. Romantic art's not really about that. It's called romantic because a lot of these paintings were based on stories, and those stories were written in Romance languages that derived from Latin. So the term romantic, it makes reference to Rome, right? So again, there's always that connection in artwork at this period, it seems, to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. But the connection is different with Romantic art. These pieces, not so much political and definitely not rational. A common theme of Romantic paintings is that humans exist within this overwhelming forces of nature. That could be things like storms, floods, tsunamis, and hurricanes. It's also the idea that humans are affected by their own nature, and that sometimes we have dark sides to ourselves. So Romanticism is kind of an exploration of the human condition and the idea that we're not in control of things. Sometimes Romantic artwork shows us the darker sides of things that happen when humans encounter each other, and other times it's humans being overwhelmed again by those forces of nature. There's an emphasis on emotion and how important emotion is to us as people. So, good example of this, Raft of the Medusa. This was painted in reaction to an actual event that took place. There was a boat called the Medusa that was sailing off the coast of Africa. It hit a storm and the boat came apart. The captain and the crew got in lifeboats and they kind of just pulled everybody else on this raft, and they hit another storm and they let the raft go and drift out to sea. So what you had is a group that started off of about 150 people that were lost at sea. They were out there for a long time. When they came to shore, there weren't many people left, and there were stories of cannibalism and shark attacks and all these horrible things. So the painting, being about that actual story, had even more of an emotional impact. The painting itself was huge. It was over 20 feet wide. So when you walked into a gallery and you encountered this piece, it definitely had a strong impact on those that saw it. Certainly a conveyance of emotion and the idea of man versus nature that we see on that raft. Another example painted by Delacroix from 1827, Death of Sardanapalus, is another painting that's based on a story, this story being about an Assyrian king that was getting ready to lose a war. And typically in wars at this time, if you won, you would have the spoils, or everything that your enemy owned would then become yours. So in order to keep that from happening, we see the king having all of his possessions destroyed right in front of him. So as he's lounging back on that bed, you see his possessions being destroyed. That includes his servants, his wives being killed, his animals being slaughtered, and all of this as he lies back with this very calm expression on his face, as if he's in control of the situation. The romantic idea of man versus man's own darker nature. The next slide, also a painting by Delacroix, Liberty Leading the People. So this was a kind of a hybrid mix probably between neoclassicism and romanticism, because it has those romantic elements of being very emotionally charged, but it has a really serious political subject matter about the French Revolution. So liberty leading the people, we see liberty being represented as a bare-breasted female carrying the flag, and then surrounded by people of different social classes, different ages, which includes a child, communicating the message that this idea of revolution at the time wasn't just for the wealthy or the poor, that it was something for everyone. And that seems to be Delacroix's message with that piece. Slide number 8 takes us to a painter in Spain. It was considered by some to be romantic because of the time period. Others say that he was way ahead of his time as far as what he was painting and the style that he did it in, and that is Francisco Goya. The scene that you're looking at is called The 3rd of May, based on an actual event that happened, again, exploring man's darker nature sometimes. After the French Revolution, Napoleon comes to power in France, doesn't seem like much of a win, starts to conquer territory, including many areas of Spain. So you have the French army on patrol through the streets of Spain. There was a curfew at night, and anyone who was out where they weren't supposed to be faced trouble with the army. One night there was a riot, and there were some groups of young people that were throwing bricks and objects at the French soldiers. They opened fire. It got heated. One of the soldiers got killed. The next night, which was the 3rd of May, the French army goes out and it rounds up any groups of young people that dare to be out, and they're executed. And that's the scene that we see happening. The French army here is presented as just being like a faceless machine that comes to a very jagged, sharp point of the rifle. And then the main subject seems to be the person standing there wearing white, a symbol for innocence, with his arms outstretched, that's about to be killed. I would classify this as romantic because of that subject matter, that idea that man's inhumanity to man seems to be the main subject. The next few slides, some different examples of Goya and some subjects that he liked to paint. And a lot of times what he painted was darker. It was about the presence of evil in humanity. This could have something to do with the way Francisco Goya was brought up. He actually witnessed a lot of awful things in his life, and he actually had a series of prints that were titled "I Saw This," and it was these different horrible scenes, especially about war and atrocities. Slide number 9 is a piece that he did about the presence of evil, and this is an exorcism that he's painting. And so you see a person lying back on the bed, and there's a priest holding a crucifix, and there's blood squirting out of it, and this is really dramatic scene that's taking place. And if you look really carefully in the background, you can see this weird kind of round-headed demon monster that I guess was the spirit that was possessing this person and need to be exorcised or gotten rid of. The next slide, also by Francisco Goya. This was his imagining of what prehistoric man was like, and as you can see, he didn't have a very bright outlook on that. So you see these people that are engaged in cannibalism, one of them holding up a human hand, and if you look carefully, he's also appears to have been castrated. So this is just a bloody, violent, dark sort of imagining by Goya. If we go to the next slide, what you're seeing taking place there seems to be some sort of magical ceremony, again, maybe along the lines of that exorcism that we looked at earlier. And the next piece relates to ancient Greek mythology. So this mythology becomes another way for Goya to explore this theme of darkness and humanity. Kronos eating his children. So according to ancient myth, the first race of living things on the earth were the Titans. And the Titans weren't human. They were, according to the stories, more like monsters, and sometimes they're thought of as being gigantic. Kronos was the oldest of the Titans, and according to that creation myth, Gaia was a goddess of earth. It was basically the earth itself, and the sky was a god. Uranus had a sexual union with Gaia. This race of things were born called the Titans. This made the sky very unhappy, and so he has these children hidden away deep inside earth, deep inside of a cave. This causes Gaia much pain, and so the earth is going through pain, and when these things come of age, the oldest Kronos decides to seek revenge against his father. So he goes up to the sky and he takes a sickle. He castrates his father, whose castrated junk falls into the ocean, and that's the birth of Venus. That's the way the Roman goddess Venus, or the Greek Aphrodite, that was the origin of that character. Kind of a bloody start for the goddess of love. Anyway, when Kronos the Titan gets older, he has his own children, and he fears that they're going to do the same thing to him that he did to his father. And in order to keep himself safe, he decides to eat his children. He devours all of them. And that's what we see happening. It looks like he's holding up a figure and chewing its head off. That's his own child that he's devouring. Well, it turns out those children he was devouring are actually the Olympian gods, and so eating them doesn't kill them. There's one that he's tricked into eating a stone instead of the kid. That turns out to be Zeus, who goes and frees his comrades, and you get this big war between the Olympian gods and the Titans. Interesting story, and definitely interesting to Goya, who definitely picked up on that darkness and that really dark theme of eating your own children. William Henry Mallard Turner in England was considered a Romanticist painter, and this is slide number 15. A lot of scenes of man versus nature come from Turner, and you'll also notice that the piece looks abstract and brushy in some ways. Later on, artists will come to call that painterly. There's painterly because you can actually see that it's made out of paint. The Slave Ship, one of his more well-known pieces, and it kind of covers a couple of popular romantic themes. There's man versus nature, where you have this small ship in this overwhelming storm at sea, and then there's the idea of man's inhumanity to man, because part of the story is that this was a ship that was hauling slaves as the cargo. When they hit a storm, in order to help keep the ship afloat, a lot of times the cargo would be thrown overboard. Of course, this is a last resort, and in this case that cargo was human beings. So if you look carefully at the area where the water is, you can see hands sticking up out of it, and you can also see some abstract shapes that are kind of reminiscent of eyes, as if these turbulent waters are also shark infested. Very powerful imagery there. The next couple of slides, also created by the same artist, Turner, and again a similar theme, man versus nature, man being very small in the face of these overwhelming natural forces. Slide number 16 shows us the influence of romantic art in the United States. So in the 1800s, the main romanticism in the United States was about the natural world, and in some ways it could be considered political because it encouraged westward expansion. In the U.S. at the time, there was the idea of manifest destiny, that somehow God had chosen the United States to be the kingdom that reached from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific. And so the U.S. was in the process of acquiring that territory, really not paying much attention to the fact that people had already lived there for thousands of years, and part of that included the Louisiana Purchase, which was this massive purchase of land from Napoleon. Napoleon needed the money for his war machine, and the U.S. wanted that land, so they bought it right out from under the people that already lived there. In order to help encourage or make the West look better to people, lots of artwork was done about it. That includes Thomas Cole's piece, The Oxbow, presenting the American frontier as a romantic place, a place where you could go to get out from under the thumb of government, where you could get away from the crowded, dirty cities, where you could start your life over again in this kind of idealistic, simple way. So a lot of times these type of paintings contain images of homesteaders, little houses with smoke coming out of the chimney, no neighbors, the idea that this place was somehow gifted to the American people by a higher power or God. So that is slide number 16, the oxbow. Also notice in the oxbow, there's a place where the sun seems to be shining in the background. In the foreground, things are really dark and they look rainy and stormy. And if you look really carefully at that place, you'll see that there are some Native Americans there. So it's possible that Thomas Cole was considering them to be living behind everyone else. That somehow their lifestyle was dark and the light of civilization was coming to them, and that's turned out to not really be the case. Next couple of slides, same painter, Thomas Cole, with the same idea. You know, sometimes you see little houses of smoke coming out of the chimney. You see a kid that's walking through the mountains barefoot with a fishing pole. These are idealized, romantic scenes of what life could be like if you ventured out into the frontier. In the 1800s, we see lots of different styles start to develop in Europe and France, and we get into all kinds of isms, and we end up with almost so many isms that you can't keep track of them anymore. Each artism that comes out, like Romanticism or Neoclassicism, there seems to be a reaction to it very quickly of another artistic style that comes about. So one reaction to the Romantic in the Neoclassical was realism, the idea that how can you present life the way it really is, and not just the way it is to mythological heroes, and not the way it is to generals, or not the way it is to people on grand adventures, but how do you present realism in the idea that we all go about our lives every day, and that's worthy of making artwork about. So realism, in a way, was visually realistic, trying to present people that aren't idealized or imaginary, and it was also a social idea of realism. What really goes on in the world, and how does that work? This brings us to really influential painting called The Gleaners, which is slide number 20. The gleaners were people that would walk into a field after the harvest and pick up what was left over. So in most cases, you had large farms with farmers that would go out with all of his help, and at harvest time everyone would pitch in. They'd make a pass through the fields and gather the crop. Instead of making a second pass to get what was left over, it was considered a form of charity to leave those crops lying there, so that the people from the community that didn't have much to eat could come and they could walk through and pick up hopefully enough food to last for a while. So the gleaners become the subject of this painting. That makes a big statement. Normally the subject of the painting would be the wealthy landowner, or it would be again a king or someone involved in some great adventure. Here it's people that you might see every day in the community, and not necessarily rich or influential people, just you might call them real everyday people. The Gleaners. Slide number 21 brings us to one of the longest titles in Western art history so far, and that title is The Interior of My Studio, a Real Allegory Summing Up 7 Years of My Life as an Artist by Gustave Courbet. And in that slide you can see that it is an artist at work in a studio. He's painting on a canvas, and if you look at the opposite sides, the right and left of the artist, you start to get an idea of what the painting's about. On one side are people that look very wealthy, they're well dressed, they're reading, so you assume maybe they've been educated. On the other side there are children, there's the elderly, there are people that are playing games and playing with animals. The statement that the artist is making by turning his back to the people on the wealthy side and looking at the other side is that that's what he sees as a new direction of art, is the idea of realism expressed with everyday people and not with mythology, represented by the nude woman holding the blanket or the sheet The future is in the real. Another realist painter, Manet, Edouard Manet in France. We're going to end up talking about Manet and Monet. Don't get them mixed up. They're two different people. Manet was associated with realism, and this painting demonstrates some aspects of that. Called Olympia. It's a reclining nude. From the Renaissance all the way back to classical times, we do see nude females in art, and up until this point, typically that nude female was used to represent a mythological character. Maybe the nude female would be Venus or Aphrodite. Manet chose to make his reclining nude a well-known prostitute from his community. So when people from the area came to see this painting, they realized that they were looking, in a way, face to face with someone who worked in prostitution, and wasn't just a mythological figure. That caused a great scandal, and it was a controversial piece. Also controversial about the piece, it kind of rejects that typical idea up till that point that paintings should copy the three-dimensional world, and that they should have this sense of illusionistic space. Here the space is very flat, and in a way it doesn't give the viewer's eyes a place to go to get away from the gaze of the person that's sitting right in front of them, and it makes it seem even more controversial and called vulgar by many. If you go to slide number 23, you'll see a side-by-side comparison with Manet's work and a painting by Renaissance painter Titian of a very similar reclining nude. Look at the differences that you see in these paintings. There's also differences in symbols. The one on the right by Titian, we see a dog, which is a symbol of fidelity and loyalty. In Manet's piece, there's a black cat, which was a symbol of sensuality and secrets. Much different sort of imagery and different ideas about the paintings. 24 is another piece by Manet, and you see some fully clothed males that are having what appears to be lunch in the woods with some fully nude females, again considered very controversial at the time. Slide 25 is a photograph of the painter Manet. So we're getting to the point when photography is starting to become widely used, and it'll eventually become what people consider more of an art form. In the early days of photography, in the early 1800s, it was very related to science. So for someone to be a photographer, they also had to be involved in some aspects of chemistry. You couldn't go to the store and pick up a pack of photo paper. Everything was pretty much do it yourself, so you had to have be able to mix up a light sensitive solution that you could apply to a material, figure out how to expose that to light, and then figure out how to process that. And if you couldn't do all those things, you couldn't be a photographer, because there wasn't anything at the time that just allowed you to push a button and make a photograph. So it was a very specialized field, and there are artists that seem to make breakthroughs when it came to considering photography a fine art. It wasn't immediately accepted as one. One thing it does give us at this time is a photographic view of an artist, and we haven't seen many of those up to this point, and that's Manet. Photography is also going to have a big influence on painting. When the photographic process was becoming widespread in Europe, which was around the 1830s. Excuse me, I had to sneeze. There were painters that feared that photography would replace painting completely, that portraits would no longer be made, history paintings would no longer be useful, because there was this invention, the camera, that could show people what places look like and what people look like in a very detailed way. Of course, that didn't happen. Painting seemed to change in some ways as a reaction to that. If we know that photography can show us details and exactly what a person or a place looks like, then in a way that frees up painting to do other things, to be expressive in other directions. And that probably led to what's known as the Impressionist movement. The leader of the Impressionist movement was Claude Monet. Again, don't get him mixed up with Manet. two different people. And Impressionism was really about the effects of light and color. Think about photography at this time. There was no color involved with it unless you went back and painted the print. So painting was a way of doing something that photography was not capable of. Another invention that you might not think of that contributed to this movement was the invention of the metal tube. So just a small metal tube where you could mix up paint and make it portable and take it with you, because painters at this time worked a lot in their studio, and they would make their own paints much in the same way as a photographer might make his own materials. That involved taking a pigment out of some material like cadmium, digging something up out of the ground or buying it, and then mixing it with linseed oil in order to make paint. If you had a metal tube, you could make it beforehand, and then painting is now portable, and you could take it anywhere you want, including to the river or out to a beautiful natural scene. So that's what Impressionist painters like to do, completing a painting very quickly, letting the brush marks show and trying to capture the effects of light and color. Slide number 27, very famous piece by Claude Monet, Water Lilies. If you look closely at it, you'll notice that there's really no black in the painting. That one thing that Impressionist painters noticed by really intensely looking at color was that in nature there's really no true black, because in order to have true black, it would be a complete absence of light, and if there was an absence of light, you couldn't see anything. It'd be like looking into a black hole. So in the shadow areas, there are different mixtures of color in order to help make that effect. Slide 28, also by Claude Monet. This was what was used to name the Impressionist movement. It's called Impression Sunrise, and it is about a sunrise, and it is done in a very loose and quick, brushy fashion. As you can imagine, when the Impressionist movement was coming about, lots of people didn't like it. They considered these works to be garbage, really, because they appeared unfinished and unsophisticated when compared to something like a painting by Jacques-Louis David. But Impressionism really affected artists and really changed the way that they start to look at things and the way that they start to use paint. Another Impressionist painter working in this time period, Renoir. And Renoir, also interested in the effects of light and color. It seems like more people enter into his more well-known paintings, as the one that you can see in slide number 29. Notice that the lighting on the people is not perfect and smooth. You see little circles of light as if sunlight is coming through trees and striking people. This is the way light really looks, and it seems like for the first time artists were really interested in what light actually does, not using it as a tool to make things look more or less dramatic or as a compositional tool, but actually looking at what light does and the effects of it. And there's a couple of pieces by Renoir. Impressionism has such an effect on the art world that what happens immediately after we refer to as just post-impressionism. And post-impressionism itself is not a specific style, it's more a description of a time period. So if something's post-impressionist, it just means it happened in that time immediately after impressionism. And there were lots of different approaches that people had to this. Some of those approaches were really scientific, exploring color. Other approaches were very emotional. That's where we get a lot of varied artwork. We get the seemingly scientific color explorations of Cezanne, and we also get the highly emotionally charged paintings of Vincent van Gogh, which were very different, but both fall into this time category of post-impressionism. And post-impressionist period is a good place to stop for today, and I'm starting to get kind of hot sitting out in the sunshine. Hey, it's been a wild week, and I hope you guys all made it through it okay. Have a great weekend. Catch up with the reading in the book. We're now on chapter 21. We'll talk about it more on Monday. Have a beautiful weekend. Be safe and be kind to yourself and others. And I'll see you soon. Thank you.